when there's a new Aimee Bender novel in the world, it's worth celebrating. And I'm excited that I get to celebrate with you by talking about it. It's pretty awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. And yeah, no, I was so delighted that you were up for talking with me about it. And
hell yes.
Hell yes.
Hell yes.
Like the audience should know, Karen and I have been friends for many, many years at this point, and it feels like a total treat to just get to see her virtually. So.
Same, mutual. For those of you who haven't read the book yet, Aimee, will you give us a little synopsis of the novel?
Well, I will just disclaim and say I'm really bad at synopsizing, but I will do my best, which is to say it's kind of a, you have a character who's about 26 looking back at a time when she's 8 and trying to sort of track something of her experience in which there were these sort of 3 supernatural incidences where something dropped out, like a butterfly that was on a painted lampshade dropped out into a glass of water. And why did that happen? But it's also about the transition from her home in Portland with her mother, who has a psychotic episode and can no longer take care of her, and the literal and sort of figurative move to her new home in Burbank with her aunt and uncle.
Because you often have children somewhere in the center of your work. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the potential pitfalls of writing from child's point of view, even if it's retrospective, like this book is, and then how you thought about avoiding those, or how you think you did if you didn't intentionally think about avoiding them.
I know some people will really avoid a child's character or narrator. Even if she's looking back, there's so many parts of this book where she's trying to immerse herself. She may have some of the vocabulary of her adult self, but she's really trying to get very close to the child's perspective. And I think some people will feel like, should they avoid child point of view or whatever, but I think I feel repeatedly like you just end up kind of drawn to the material that you're drawn to, and as a writer are a bit helpless to that. And when the work shows up and it feels like it's working, that's the material to follow. And so there was just, I guess I was interested in Francie's voice, and I am interested in children's point of view and what is it like to try to understand the worlds that we saw before we could articulate what we were seeing, and that sort of gap being maybe an essential part of growing up, and a kind of naming that has a loss component to it, but has an enormous gain that you sort of can have a little more understanding. So I guess the potential pitfalls are a kind of cutesiness. And also I think people think that kids aren't absorbing a darkness and with great sensitivity. Like someone was asking, like, your child characters are, very sensitive to the world, but I guess a part of me feels like, I think all kids are kind of like, they are little, they are those little vacuums of emotional life, and they can't generally articulate what they're picking up on. And the adults, even the really with it adults, are still leaking out all over the place, like that is the nature of adulthood. You're not like, you have an unconscious, like, stuff comes out, and the kids are just like, yeah. And that is why when Flannery O'Connor says childhood gives you the material of a life, to write about, that's a bad paraphrase, but like, it feels like there's so much minutia that is very deep. Right?
Can you talk a little bit about how Francie is responsible for the things she's unhappy about? Does that make sense? Or the things she wishes were different? I mean, on the one hand, she has a mentally ill mother, so the world is throwing her a problem that she has to deal with. Yeah. She deals with it in remarkable and heartbreaking ways, I think. I mean, heartbreaking in the best way. But on the other hand, she's also a troublemaker in a kind of, she stirs the pot.
She does. She has a little like aggressive push. Yeah. She does. Yeah. And with a kind of fragile mother, that's very dangerous, because she can sort of tip her mother into a really unhappy place that is kind of her fault, but also, it's that complicated dynamic. Like there's something interesting when you have a kind of fragile parent figure. What would be a normal sort of teenage push is going to have a much more severe impact. So there's something, I am really interested in that, like distortion about power. But yeah, no, I mean, I think in some ways Francie's sort of like really overburdened by a sense of her own power, and like locks herself in a room, like there's some feeling like she's so destructive and dangerous. And at the same time is, poking at her mother because she can, and because she sort of can't resist that. Yeah. And that I wanted her mother to be sort of afraid of her because her mother has a distorted sense of her. And I also wanted her mother to be afraid of her because Francie is a kid, and, kids are not angelic.
We as readers know pretty early on in the book about these three visions, she calls them, right? The three objects breaking through our sense of what's real world and what's not. I know what happened. Right. I know what the events are, right? Very early on in the book. But then when I return to them in the later parts that are titled Butterfly or Beetle or Roses or Rose, I'm still kind of on the edge of my seat. And that suspense does not have to do with event, which is decidedly in the past. That for me had to do with what is her revisitation going to mean for her in the present? How is she going to see it differently? What is going to change in her understanding of it? Given how much of this book is about memory, and in a kind of Tim O'Brien, things they carried sort of loop-de-loop way of returning to memory and bringing it back into real life, it is also so organizationally structured. So I wonder if you could talk about the relationship to just the scaffolding of form, especially the different lengths of chapters, with the content of what you're describing.
And I think in terms of form, I mean, I guess this is where it feels really hard for me to separate a book that has its own specific content from the action of writing to do it, because I feel like forever since I've been writing, it's been very much about creating a certain kind of box of time to allow space for something to go to some place that feels like it's complicated and out of my understanding. And the only reason I can sort of tolerate touching that place is because I know I'm going to stop in 3 minutes or whatever, and that I'll kind of set, let's say I have an hour and then I'll stop at that hour. I always feel like that is because I know I'm going to stop. And maybe in a similar way, because that just has worked for me, like it just, that matching of a kind of limit and a kind of murky territory of the mind. These are the two things, they just feel very matched to me. So I think formally to have the chapters and the titles and the things, and some chapters being short, in part because they came in bursts when I was having a shorter writing time because I had little babies. And like I just was like, I have a half an hour. So, and that chapter seems to work. So I'm going to keep it. And then longer ones having a little more time to sustain and build, and then trying to match them together and see if they fit adequately enough to create some kind of flow. So I feel like this territory that I was trying to circle around also of like, what's real and what's not real? When does it matter? When does it not matter? When does that blurred line become a crisis that the person can no longer live and function in a normal situation? When is it something that we carry around? When is it imagination? Like, what are all these things? What are all these blurrinesses? That territory feels so gray and so blurry that to have like a little chapter end and to be able to have white space felt really calming, actually.
Yeah. It was like you're describing about the pacing, if every book teaches us how to be a reader of it, it's going slow down, and don't expect the world to be the way you think it is, right? Be open to the world of the novel, the world of Francie, your own world, being filled with the extraordinary. And I think Francie is struggling with that.
Yeah.
Right? Is it an amazing thing that a beetle came off a page?
Right.
Or is that a sign that too much of her mother is in her and she's crazy, you know.
Right. There's something made tangible. Right. And it's, yeah, I think it's both. I mean, I actually feel like these incidences and whatever they mean, and there's different things that people are, you know, interpreting, which is always really interesting for me to hear, but that there's a quality, hopefully, I think, of both, of something really frightening and a kind of rupture, but that the rupture also feels true. Like there's maybe one of the scenes that feels most like sort of like it felt like a turning point for me in the writing of the book was the moment where she's sort of sitting with the presence of the beetle on the train, and she's just, there's like an acceptance of it as like here's a thing that this has happened, and whatever the layers of that acceptance is, but to be like, you can't deny the thing when it's a thing, whatever that thing is. And that somehow felt really key to me, that it's like these things are asserting their presence, their dead presence in the world to her, and that she can't, you know, she can't ignore that. Like that's going to track, that's part of her life.
In what ways do you think those three objects are confounding to being placed as an understandable thing, an understandable story? Does that make sense?
I think so. I mean, I guess it comes from the fact that I don't know what they are. That seems like that's like a big
way to take a weakness and make it a strength.
I mean, I think it's probably it's gonna be a mixed experience for people, because I think the book is not gonna answer that question, right? And I don't want it to answer that question for exactly what you're saying, which is I don't want any one-to-one relationship, but the way to avoid it in my mind is to be like, I'm drawn toward this image physically. I'm drawn towards writing about it repeatedly as a physical experience, and then to be like, then whatever meaning they have kind of hopefully can just resonate or accrue on its own. And yeah, I think like it was, in some ways it felt worrisome to be like, one of these things is a butterfly and I'm having a person sort of deal with their own growth. Like that feels like scary territory, you know, but I also felt like it's dead. Like somehow I felt like, but it's definitely a dead butterfly.
Yes, it's not hatching and flying.
It's not.
Yeah.
So it's like she is trying, and there is growth in her, but also it's subtle and complex. And so there's no like burst of, you know, so, and that somehow the beetle felt helpful. So a lot of that, yeah, I think it's like when I think of Kafka as such a model of just being like, let's just spend time talking about Gregor's legs as a vermin or a roach or whatever you want him to be, depending on your translation, you know, like it's just so physicalized, and that feels so helpful to give the reader a lot of room to interpret.
Yeah. Well, I think also there's a point in the book where Francie uses the word visitations to describe the objects, and other people describe them as incidents or whatever, but visitations is such an interesting word. Can you talk about that word choice?
Well, yeah, I think that's when I wanted it to be that there was some way that she was like a witness to something, and that other people did see it. Like I wanted to kind of clarify that it wasn't just entirely in her head and there was confirmation about that, but that what that then would be unknowable, you know, and would remain unknowable to some degree, but would still have meaning to her. And so in a visitation, that there's some other place, I guess there's a sort of, she enters this family that's a much more sort of grounded, stable family, and it really is like a different world than the one that she came from, and she really has a foot in both worlds. And to let her have a visitation from something that also has a foot in both worlds, that's not supposed to be any representation of her, because you can't sort of make the match. Like she wasn't two-dimensional, you know, it wasn't like, but at the same time to feel like, what are these things that are living in two spaces? And that interests me, you know, and that's part of a reading experience too, right? Aren't we living in two spaces when we read? We have our own mind and we're in the mind of the writer. and we're living with both alongside, and it just feels like that sort of duality is really interesting.
I imagine there are lots of ways in which this, as you look back at this book as a made object, that it makes sense that you made this object now. But I'm kind of curious about the ways in which you look back at it and are surprised that things you didn't think you were doing, or things you taught yourself as you were doing it, that seem like an evolution of some kind, or seem slightly off center from what you understood your work to be and your relationship to it to be.
I mean, it's still, I think, newly enough out that I'm not sure yet. Like, I feel like I'm just even now getting a handle on talking about it as a thing and thinking about it. And I'm just sort of feeling that process in place. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you would say. You can help me on this one, Karen. Like, give me some language on this.
But I don't know. I mean, I asked the question without really having a solid answer to it, because I was thinking about it a lot while I was reading your stuff, because I've read all of your stuff. So it felt, I was like, on the one hand, this felt like being in a familiar territory world. And on the other hand, there felt like something new happening. And I don't know exactly how I would pinpoint it. Maybe it is the pacing even, although I would say that your pacing is always reminding us to slow down.
Ultimately, this book did occur at what feels like, one of the largest, if not the largest pivot in my life. And so that being like a huge transition, and to contend with what is it like to be a writer and a mother, and how are the two, what do they look like together? And and so sitting in that space, I think that's, and maybe just like not having any sort of quiet time to sit and think.
Yeah, well, no, there's very practical. There's very practical things too, right? I mean, I think when you talk about, well, sometimes I only had time for one of those one-page chapters, I think that's really true. We write when we're not thinking about other lives, and that's almost always when you're a mom.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that, right, there's so much planning, like you say, and that so this kind of very different liminal place. Just to circle back quickly on something you were saying about the process of writing and reading that you were feeling sort of aware of in the book. And I think the truth is, no matter what to apply it to, because I feel like there's something about the process of moving through something, and it can be writing a book, it can be one thing, but there's so, like, anything that you're sort of like committing to the thing and trying to move through it, relationships, like any sort of internal work, like all of this stuff, that's the juice for me. Like, that is the stuff of life. And I think that's where I find all the value, like, it just feels like I really, it's so, I mean, it just feels like, or whatever, most of the value, but just, it feels like it's such a, it feels like a big piece of what makes me right, like, it just feels like that sense of moving through something that you're not fully aware of the movement until you're through it.
Well, I mean, that phrase that's in the novel, witness to rupture, that is that is the writer's position, is just that we are responsible for the rupture. I mean, we're both witness and rupturer. And so,
right.
And in terms of agency and responsibility, that's a fraught and usefully fraught position to be in when you're trying to teach yourself about the world, I think.
Yeah. So we're going to read, I've been actually asking whoever I've been talking to read with me, and people have been willing, including Karen. But she and I are going to read a scene that has not yet been read, which is a little bit exciting. So the main character, Francie, is thinking back of a particular time in her life. This is actually a sort of break from that time, but there was a sort of transition where she was living with her mom, and then she goes to living with her aunt and uncle, and she has these two sort of encounters, these kind of supernaturally encounters. And this is something that happens in high school, where she has the third one, where she sees these roses at the base of a curtain where there's pictures of roses. So these things have kind of traversed the boundary between a made thing and a natural dead item. So So she's really agitated by the reoccurring experiences of this, and they make her feel really deeply unsettled. And so she wants to go see a doctor. And so just the whole doctor scene is set in a dialogue. So Karen has agreed to be the doctor.
Do you ever hear voices?
No.
Do you ever think anyone is following you?
No.
Do you ever think thoughts have been implanted in your mind?
No, really, it's just the roses.
Is there a history of mental illness in your family?
Yes.
Who might that be?
My mother.
And your father?
Unknown.
Can you recall any other moments where you have seen a vision like what you described?
There have been no other moments except the ones I just mentioned. And it wasn't a vision. My friend Dina saw them too.
The roses?
Yes.
What did she think they were from?
She had no idea. She was very surprised. Her family hates dried roses.
You don't happen to have them here.
I do.
They look like regular dried roses.
They are regular dried roses, except they are made out of nothing.
And explain again how you know this.
They were under the curtains.
But surely someone might have just accidentally dropped dried roses under the curtains.
Except Dina was shocked too.
Just by the presence of dried roses in her house?
Yes.
They dislike dried roses that much?
They really do.
Well, okay, fine. Explain it more to me then. What you think is that somehow the embroidered roses came to life and dropped out of the curtain and onto the floor and became dried roses.
Yes.
And when was your mother's first psychotic break?
She was 17.
And you are?
17.
But you seem to understand that curtains cannot make roses.
I do.
Did you see the roses emerge from the curtains?
No, not at all. I've never seen that part. They were just there on the floor when I walked by.
So what do you make of it?
Me? What do I make of it? That's why I'm here.
And your brain scan and testing all look fine.
It always looked fine.
But then
Francie.
Have you ever seen a psychotherapist?
Yes.
And?
It's not a metaphor.
You mean the roses?
Right. The roses are not a metaphor.
But did it help?
It just wasn't enough.
I understand, but I have to admit I'm finding myself a little confused. If you don't think this comes from your own mind, and you believe you're witnessing some sort of phenomenon, and you aren't demonstrating any other symptoms, why make an appointment with a neurologist?
Who else am I supposed to see?
To implicate the world in its own rupture?
Exactly.
I have no idea.
And also, doctor, to your earlier point.
A priest?
If it was just a casual drop at Dina's, why would they match the curtain exactly? As in exactly, except dead. And what about the butterfly and the beetle?
Or a shaman? Some kind of transcendental monk?
Are you making fun of me?
Sorry, just trying to brainstorm. Do you know how much time passed between each incident?
The roses were 2 days ago. The beetle was a day after the butterfly, which was 10 years ago.
And were there any corresponding events in your life at these times?
Excuse me?
Were there any events in your life around the time of each incident that might connect?
Why would that be relevant? It's not just about me.
Is it happening to someone else?
Isn't it?
Francie, have you heard of anyone else talking about anything remotely like this?
I mean, the only thing,
Yes.
just my mother not doing well and me upsetting her and her not being able to take care of me. It's not really viable data.
But has that happened each time?
Possibly.
Possibly?
The butterfly, yes. The beetle was basically at the same time, so yes. The roses just happened.
And
what?
And how is your mother doing?
She left her facility a few weeks back and she tried to get her own apartment to see if she could take me back.
Did she succeed?
She did not.
Is she doing okay now?
We had a bad visit, but I don't see that there's any clear link to any of that.
What happened with the visit?
I sent her over the back of a chair.
You pushed her?
No, I was talking to her about all this stuff about the butterfly. It was dumb. She tipped herself over.
She's all right?
Physically, yes. Otherwise, improving.
And you were really going to move back up there?
I had no plans to go.
Well, it seems notable, doesn't it? All these events around the same times.
Not to me.
There may not be a link, but
You're just making random guesses.
I'm just trying to gather information, Francie, looking for patterns.
What could the patterns possibly be?
Well, I'm not sure. Let's review again for a moment. We'll try another angle. What was the order again here? Butterfly, beetle, roses? Butterfly first?
Yes.
Beetle on the train?
2 days after the butterfly.
Roses just this week.
Yes.
So whatever may be happening, Francie, whatever this may be, one might also wonder if you are progressing from the entomological world into the botanical.
Doctor,
There haven't been other categories, have there?
what do you mean categories?
Such as rodents, mammalia.
Why do you keep treating this like it's a real thing?
Perhaps, Francie, the power is fading.
It's not a power.
Perhaps, Francie, the incidents are fading.
They can't be real incidents.
Francie, didn't you just say that your friend Dina saw the roses too, and that you truly believe they came from the curtains?
They can't actually come from the curtains, can they, Doctor?
Francie, are we even having the same conversation here?
I just don't understand how any of this can happen.
They're all dead?
Excuse me?
The things you find, they're all dead?
Yes.
And are they dead in the picture?
No.
The roses in the curtain?
Are stitchings of alive, blossoming roses.
And the beetle?
Was from an illustration of a stag beetle walking on a twig for a grade school test.
And the beetle you found was dead.
Rigid as a rock.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, I've wondered about that too.
What do you make of it?
I don't know. What do you make of it?
I don't know.
It's sad when you think about it.
Because
Just to make that leap all the way into the living world, to make this miraculous leap and then blam.
does seem like a waste of a good miracle, doesn't it?
That first time when I found the butterfly in the water glass, I actually thought it must have come alive and flown off the lamp only to somehow fall and drown in a water glass.
That's where you found it, in a water glass?
Yeah.
Did you drink it?
Yes.
Just a hunch. Did you eat the beetle?
Disgusting. No.
Go on.
That's it. Just that at first I thought the butterfly was alive for a little while and then died. But now I think that's wrong. They're all dead. They arrived dead.
It's consistent.
It certainly is. But doctor, what is the it?
I guess that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
I guess so.
I'm gonna say thank you for talking, and tell everyone who hasn't already bought the book to go out and buy it for everyone in their families. It makes great Hanukkah and Christmas gifts. And just think of it as putting food on Aimee Bender's twins' table. It was so great to see you, Aimee.
Oh, it's so great to see you too. And thank you for those questions, which are so substantive and satisfying to think about.
Oh man, we could talk on and on.
We could.